Welcome to Small Talk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of Small Talk, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Dovid Jaffee, who is the author of the newly published expanded edition of the volume What Can I Say Today? Shmiras Haloshon in Contemporary Times with Today's Challenges, published by Adir Press. Thank you, Rabbi Dovid, for joining me.
Okay, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
What can you tell the listeners about this book?
The Sefer is a book that I put many years into in trying to clarify the practical Nogei L'Maisa issues with Shmiras Haloshon. Many people are learning Chafetz Chaim and other Sfarim that are based on Chafetz Chaim, which are beautiful Sfarim, but I always felt that I had difficulty applying it in the practical contemporary challenges and shilas that come up, and that's what I'm trying to accomplish with the Sefer.
That's what I was going to ask you, which is, I'm sure you get asked all the time, wait, I'll just learn Chafetz Chaim, I'll learn Shmiras Haloshon. I don't need a contemporary volume, right? There's translations, adaptations of Chafetz Chaim. So how does your Sefer differ from that?
Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background. I remember when I was younger and learning in Kollel, and I would sit with my chaverim, and we would have a discussion. And I remember being at the table, the Beis Medrash, and wondering that discussion. And sometimes I would say to them, maybe there's Lashon Hara over here, Avak Lashon Hara. And we would handle back and forth, and you'd go and maybe even ask a shaila to someone. They would say, probably not, or, yeah, it's probably Lashon Hara. And we would try to look in the Chafetz Chaim, and it just wasn't so clear. I think the Chafetz Chaim had a different agenda than perhaps what we're trying to do nowadays. The Chafetz Chaim was dealing with a generation where Shmiras Haloshon was not even on the radar screen. And if someone goes through Sefer Chafetz Chaim, they'll see a lot of it is saying either things that are pashut. He'll go and say it's us, or whether it's a man, to say about a man, about a woman, a relative, someone who's not a relative, etc. He's trying to bring to people's awareness that this Isser exists. He'll go through an entire klal talking about Apei Tlas, and at the end he'll say, but that heter of Apei Tlas doesn't really apply, and you can't use that. And I think what we're dealing with today is, Baruch Hashem, the Chafetz Chaim was so successful in his campaign. Everyone knows about Shmiras Haloshon, but some of the nitty-gritty details are really not so clear in Sefer Chafetz Chaim, both because that wasn't necessarily his point. His point was to bring it to people's awareness. And number two, just like anything, in Hilchos Shabbos, you can't just learn Hilchos Shabbos straight out of the Mishnah Berurah. You need to have contemporary applications. So too in Shmiras Haloshon, most of the shilas that I get asked are not really dealt with beferish in the Chafetz Chaim.
Okay, so what is it that you do? You start off the book defining Lashon Hara. What is it besides definition? What is it that you set out to do? I mean, you talked about the practical application, but how do you actually practically apply it to today's day?
Well, I think it's like any other modern day halacha sefer, whether it's Rav Simcha ben Cohen on Hilchos Shabbos or all the many other halacha svarim. What they're doing is they're going through the different poskim and trying to come up with contemporary scenarios. So let me just give some examples of things that are relevant. Can you write a negative review online? Can I say Lashon Hara about myself? There's a famous story at the Chafetz Chaim about that, but it's really not so clear if from the Sefer Chafetz Chaim if he's really going to be machmer on that shaila. Are you allowed to talk about, let's say, Lashon Hara about someone who's no longer alive? Are there guidelines of what I can say to my wife? In the Chafetz Chaim, it says it's just as asur to one's wife. So when one comes home from a day at work or yeshiva, are they allowed to say anything to their wife they wouldn't be allowed to say about anybody else? What about reading newspapers? What about publishing articles? All these questions are things that aren't really so clear, and I'm trying to collect from many different, both diukim from the Chafetz Chaim and a collection of many different poskim. I've probably looked at hundreds of svarim in preparing the sefer and trying to present those halachas.
So this is a Svarim and Jewish history podcast. What about book reviews? Can one give a negative book review?
Okay, yeah, so that's something that's discussed in the Sefer. And it has to do with a couple of different points. Number one is sometimes the author might want to have a book review. In order to have a review, there has to be some actual feedback. And that's going to get into a question of when someone gives rishus to say Lashon Hara, perhaps that'll be mutter. But of course, the book review has to be done in a way that one's not going to be left with a negative impression. It's just like anything. There's a critique. These are the milas of it, And perhaps this point could be a little bit done a little bit better. So if it would be done with the author's permission, and he sees the book review and he says that's fine, then that would be okay. But that's like just an example of one of the many nuanced shilas that can come up, and I try to deal with them as best as I can.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just one of the things. You have a chapter about Lashon Hara that is not about Jewish people. So you have regarding Akum, and then you have speaking about someone's possessions, which is not a person, negative speech about Eretz Yisrael. Chapter 5, you have a whole chapter about relating that someone committed a sin. Someone doesn't have Aaron, you have different things. You talk about Abikairis, Mumur, Tinek Shenishba. Those are fascinating topics that come up, and you discuss that in depth. Apeit Lasa, public information, something that Chafetz Chaim discusses, but here you go through, very in depth.
Well, let me just point out about that.
You go ahead.
This is one of the most important heterim in Shmiras Haloshon, which you go through a cursory reading of the Chafetz Chaim, and he kind of says that you can't rely on it. But there are many poskim that have different rayas from what he says in the Ber Mayim Chaim, although it's not straight out, that if something actually became public, it's motev. The Chafetz Chaim is discussing something that was said in front of 3 people, and he has many reasons who says it's really going to become public and therefore don't rely on it. But when it actually became public, there might be more room to be mako with of course, numerous guidelines. But that would just be an example of something that one wouldn't really realize what the heter is based on just learning Chafetz Chaim and Shmiras Haloshon.
Now, chapter 7 is Te'eles. That's something that you always hear people say, oh, it's Te'eles, I'm allowed to say it. So here you go through quite in-depth. It's a pretty long, in-depth chapter. We're not going to capture it all here in the small talk, but Te'eles, a constructive purpose. If you want to just explain briefly what it is that you focus on in that long chapter.
Well, Te'eles is one of the more challenging parts of Sefer Chafetz Chaim, because the Chafetz Chaim writes many different conditions. He has 7 different conditions in order to say Lashon Hara. You'd have to know the information firsthand. You have to make sure that you have pure intentions, that your kavanah is really for the Te'eles and not with any personal agenda. And he goes on through many different conditions. And it's difficult to know how to apply those conditions, especially since in the Chafetz Chaim itself, other places, he doesn't write all 7 conditions. Sometimes he'll say you only need 5 conditions. And this is one of the tricky parts of learning Sefer Chafetz Chaim. And a person really needs to be ma'ayin. And there have been Sfarim, the excellent Sfarim, the Sifas Chaim and Chalkas Ben Yamin and other excellent Sfarim that really go through the different steers in the Chafetz Chaim and learning when do you need which condition and under what circumstances. There would be certain situations where one would not need to know it firsthand, but you'd have to express, I don't really know this information firsthand, etc. So there are a lot of nitty-gritty details that I try to explain in that chapter.
The next chapter, which is another 50-page massive chapter, which is Shidduchim, something that comes up all the time for all of us. So what do you discuss about Shidduchim, and what should one do about Shidduchim?
Right, so that's such an important question. And I think we understand with Shidduchim, perhaps more than any other area in Shmiras Haloshon, how careful that we have to be. There's always a halacha of an Isser of Lashon Hara, but sometimes people perhaps justify, okay, what difference is it going to make when I say this? But when it comes to Shidduchim, we all understand that you're having a major impact on another person's life. But this requires a tremendous shikol, because on one hand, there are those people that say, okay, I don't want to say anything negative about another person, and because I realize it could affect their life. So they don't say anything. And at times, that negative information is actually a chiyuv, to say that negative information, and to be able to set someone up with someone who is not compatible for them and would lead to a bad marriage or a divorce, chas v'shalom, is something that is our responsibility to prevent. And a lot of what I discuss is this delicate balance about what to say and how to say it. And there's lots of differences. And again, this is another point that the Chafetz Chaim hardly talks about. He says that if someone's an apikoros, you could say that they're an apikoros. But most of the details and most of the shilas that I get really aren't dealt with in the Chafetz Chaim, and they're dealt with more contemporary poskim, having to do with, was I asked a question, and how do I respond when I'm asked? What if I wasn't asked? Can I get involved? Let's say it's a relative. Is there more that I can say to a relative? There's some poskim that say that. There are a lot of details, and these are from the most difficult shilas in Shmiras Haloshon.
Right, you have after the engagement, and so on and so forth. So it depends when it is. Like you said, ask information, being told. There's all different nitty-gritty questions.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
There's a lot of details that you go through extensively. You also have a chapter on avak Lashon Hara, implicit Lashon Hara, negative information that can be interpreted positively. These are things that are not it's hard to define. And what do you
Right.
do when it's not clear?
Right. And I try to illustrate with different examples. The truth is, a person, even after learning a sefer on Shmiras Haloshon, needs to have a shikol hadas, and they need to be able to weigh the different factors of the situation. And therefore, of course, a person needs to have a rav who they're able to ask. But this is at least informing people, when do I ask a rav? There's so many times that people don't even realize something's an issue, or they're so machmer on themselves, they don't realize, no, there are important heterim that are relevant over here. And that's what I'm trying to give over to the reader.
Accepting Lashon Hara. This is a whole other chapter. It's a totally different thing. Now you're listening and you're accepting. And when do you have to be chayshish for that Lashon Hara? Something might come to damage you or be a monetary loss. It's not clear also.
Right. Am I allowed to believe Lashon Hara when I hear this? I get this question so many times because the Chavetz Chaim says a person's not allowed to believe Lashon Hara. And people have such a hard time with that halacha because they hear something from a reliable person. How am I supposed to deal with that? And that's something that I discussed. There's actually a quote from the Chazon Ish that the Chazon Ish might have had a little bit of a different approach than the Chavetz Chaim on that halacha. And that's something that I discussed there in the Sefer of, we're not malachim, and we have to do the best that we can not to believe it. Maybe there's a detail that was left out, and trying to navigate that pasha.
What about rechilos?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so rechilos is something that's discussed there also. Rechilos is when I say information which is going to get two people upset each other. What's so interesting is that in Sefer Chavetz Chaim, he has two separate sections. He has Lashon Hara and he has rechilos. But if you go through the halachas, it's almost basically the same. It's almost, people think that there's a tremendous difference in Hilchos Lashon Hara rechilos. I believe really what the Chavetz Chaim was trying to do was part of what I said before, is he's trying to bring on people's radar screen. And he wants to explain with Rachel Bitcha HaKatana that don't think that what I said about Lashon Hara is different by rechilos, and therefore he goes through almost the same thing by rechilos. There are very few differences in halacha between Lashon Hara and rechilos. I do discuss some minute differences. And another point is that there's certain things that he adds in one place and doesn't say in the other place. Divrei Torah, aniyim b'makom echad, v'ashim b'makom acher. Sometimes he'll just add something in Hilchos Rechilos, which is very relevant for Lashon Hara, or vice versa. And the way I did in the Sefer is I put everything together, and then the unique elements of Rechilos I discussed in the section about Rechilos.
So I mentioned in the beginning that this is the second expanded edition, although I mentioned to you often that I don't recall seeing the first edition. But you told me that that one of the things that is new to this edition is you have responsa of Rabbi Yitzchak Berkowitz. How did you come to those? Why did you include them? And give the listener an idea of what those are.
Well, the truth is there's two parts in the response. Actually, the Rabbi Yitzchak Berkowitz was actually part of the original edition. Those responses were already there in the original edition. The editor of my Sefer is a Talmud of Rabbi Yitzchak Berkowitz, and as I was writing the Sefer, he just shared with me various different questions that he had a database of shilas that people had asked for Berkowitz, who's one of the leading poskim in Yerushalayim on Shmiras Haloshon. And as he was sharing them with me, I said to him, wow, wouldn't it be a great idea if we could share with the Rabbim these tshuvas? And he's dealing with real practical shilas. He really goes through online reviews. I think that's the most extensive discussion I've ever seen about that. And I said, wouldn't that be great if we make that part of the Sefer? And Rabbi Berkowitz was interested in helping us, and we went through that, and we added that to the Sefer. Now, that was really there in the first edition. What I added in this new edition is my own Shelos Teshuvos, because I got a lot of feedback about the first edition of the Sefer. People asked me shilas, they wrote me emails, both questions about the Sefer, and different shilas. They just asked me, and shidduch shilas, and all types of complicated shilas. I got shilas from therapists, etc. And as I was putting out this new edition, I thought, wouldn't it be a great idea if I could share the questions that are really bothering people? I mean, I wrote the Sefer thinking, okay, this is how I'm going to present it to people. When you get actual feedback and real life questions that people are asking, I thought that would be such a valuable thing. And so I arranged those and I added those to the Sefer. So you get to see, I always enjoy it when there's a Sefer that you learn and you see a question that someone asked about the Sefer and how the author response to the Sefer gives much more depth and insight, and that's what I was trying to share with those.
What sources did you use? Obviously, you used Chavetz Chaim, and I also want to, in your answer, also expound upon, is this Sefer just expounding upon Chavetz Chaim? Is he like the basis for everything in the Sefer, or did you use a lot of other sources as well? Okay,
that's an important question. Of course, the Sefer is based on Chavetz Chaim, and throughout almost every page of the Sefer, there's going to be something that's quoted from the Chavetz Chaim. But as I mentioned before, there's so many difficulties people might not realize with learning Chofetz Chaim. It's a really hard sefer to learn, the Ber Mayim Chaims and different steers in the Chofetz Chaim, plus the new contemporary applications or certain questions that the Chofetz Chaim just didn't deal with so clearly. So I really use many, many Sfarim. Both, as I mentioned before, there are a number of Mefarshim on the Chofetz Chaim, like the Nesivos Chaim and the Chalkas Binyamin, the Alei Be'er, and others. So I definitely use those. There are other Sfarim that are written on Shmiras Haloshon. But really, this was a product of years of work. I was collecting shuvas and different things that I would bump into that had anything to do with Shmiras Haloshon. There's one shaila I found in the Stei Chemed who discusses, are you allowed to say that one Rav is a bigger Rav than another Rav? There are many, many, perhaps obscure Sfarim that I'll talk about shailas and Shmiras Haloshon. Almost all of the contemporary shailas and shuvas have perhaps one or two shuvas in Shmiras Haloshon, whether it's Igros Moshe, Rav Vosner, Rabbi Yamin Zilber and Oz Nidbaru, many other contemporary shuvas. And what I've been doing over a number of years is collecting. And so I've used dozens, probably over 100 Sfarim in trying to collect the Sefer.
You have a number of Askamas. Do you want to tell the listener about some of your Askamas and who you got Askamas from?
Okay, so I live in Baltimore, so I started with the Rosh Yeshiva in Baltimore, Aaron Feldman, and the leading Rabbanim in Baltimore. And they were encouraging of the Sefer. And also, I went to Rav Shmuel Kamenetsky, and he gave a Haskama on the Sefer. And as I mentioned before, Rav Yitzhak Berkowitz was involved in the Sefer. He gave his own Sheilos Shuvas as part of the Sefer, and he gave a very warm Haskama for the Sefer as well. Who
is the Sefer meant for?
Okay, that's such an important question. And the answer I say is the Sefer is meant for everyone. I really tried to write in a Sefer. It's an English Sefer with extensive Hebrew footnotes. And so many different people have learned the Sefer and benefited from the Sefer. From Rabbanim have given me very positive feedback. One Rav told me that he learns the Sefer every night with his wife at dinner and has greatly benefited from from learning the Sefer at the table. To Beis Yaakov teachers learn it, to Balabatim, to Yungalite. And I think it's a type of Sefer I tried my best to make it that every person could relate to it on their level. I tried very hard to make it very, very clear and give practical examples in the English, so even someone on a more basic level would be able to appreciate that. And I have extensive footnotes being mefalpel with the sugyas and bringing down what the contemporary poskim say on it, and that's something that an accomplished Talmid Chacham can appreciate as well.
Finally, what are you trying to accomplish with the Sefer?
What I'm trying to accomplish is basically what I've been trying to bring across the whole time, is that it's so important to know, not just have an awareness that Shmiras Haloshon exists and that there's an Isra of Lashon Hara and Rechilos, but how do I apply it in my life? And there's so many day-to-day examples that I need to know how to apply it. And just from my own experience and the experience of the people I've seen, there was such a lack of clarity as, is this Lashon Hara or not? Everything just ended up being a gray area. So there's two people. There are people that are machmer on everything. There are people just decided to be makel on everything. And I'm trying to give clarity that we can go through every day of our life having clarity of what I'm allowed to say and what I'm not allowed to say.
Okay, so I will link to the book in the show notes. It's available, like I said, at your press, distributed Feldheim, so it's available in most farm stores. You can find it, but I'll link in the show notes. And for those interested, can check it out. And as well as, Rabbi Dovid, I want to mention that you have a new Sefer out as well in Hebrew about Chachmei Mishnah, Toldos Chachmei Mishnah, which is fascinating. So perhaps we'll do a podcast about that in the future. And thank you very much for joining me here on Small Talk.
Okay, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.